She smiled as she walked down the aisle, wearing her sister's wedding dress. No one noticed the switch. Not the guests. Not the priest. And definitely not the man waiting at the altar, the powerful Korean Mafia boss she had stolen. Because tonight, she had one. She was always the smarter twin. The one who knew how to take what she wanted, and keep it. But the moment he lifted her veil, his lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. And that's when her heart dropped. Because instead of anger, instead of shock, he leaned closer and whispered, "I know you're not her. I chose you." Her breath caught. Chosen? No. That wasn't part of the plan. Then his grip tightened around her hand, cold, controlling, inescapable. And his next words shattered everything she thought she knew. "And I'm not a mafia boss either. Welcome to KAfroStories. Where African passion meets Korean intensity, and every story hides a secret you won't see coming." Tonight's story isn't just about love. It's about deception, power, and a game so dangerous, even the winner loses. Before we step into this twisted world, hit that like button and subscribe to KAfroStories, because stories like this, they only get darker, and better. Now tell me this. If you had the chance to take a life that wasn't yours, wealth, power, everything you ever dreamed of, would you take it, even if it meant losing yourself completely? And if everything fell apart, who would still stand beside you when the truth comes out? Drop your answer in the comments. Because in tonight's story, trust is just another illusion. The music swelled, soft, elegant, and deceptively peaceful. To the 100 guests watching the entrance, the melody was a celebration of love. To Zara Okoye, it was a funeral march for her sister's future. Standing behind the towering oak doors, Zara felt the heavy weight of the hand-stitched lace against her skin. The dress was a masterpiece of ivory silk, but it wasn't hers. Neither was the bouquet of white lilies trembling in her grip, nor the scent of jasmine clinging to her hair. Everything about this moment was stolen. Across town, her twin sister, Zina, was likely still sleeping off the celebratory tea Zara had prepared. Zina, the softer one. The kinder one. The foolish one who believed that a man like Han Seol could be tamed by a gentle heart. Zara's lips curled into a faint, sharp smirk behind her veil. Zina never deserved a man of this caliber. Han Seol was a king of the underworld, a shadow that moved through Seoul and Lagos with equal parts grace and terror. He represented wealth that could buy legacies and influence that could crush enemies with a whisper. He represented everything Zara had hungered for since they were children sharing a single bed in a cramped apartment. Tonight, the hierarchy of the Okoye twins changed forever. Zara adjusted her posture, her spine turning to steel. She had spent months mimicking Zina's stutter, her shy downward glances, and her hesitant laugh. She had mapped out the contours of a life she intended to occupy like a conquering soldier. She didn't just want the man, she wanted the throne he sat upon. The heavy doors groaned as they began to swing open. A wash of golden light spilled over her, illuminating the path of rose petals that led toward the altar. She took a breath, drawing the light deep into her lungs until it felt like truth. With a slow, practiced grace, she stepped forward. Every eye in the room turned toward her, but she only saw him, the dark silhouette of the man waiting at the end of the aisle. The trap was set. The predator had become the bride. And as the first step of her new life hit the floor, Zara Okoye let the girl she used to be die. The lie had officially begun. The marble floor amplified the rhythmic tap of her heels, making every step echo through the grand cathedral like a quiet countdown. Zara kept her head bowed in a flawless imitation of her sister's demure nature, letting the thick, intricately beaded veil shield the calculating gleam in her eyes. At the end of the aisle, he waited. Jean Kwan. He stood as still as a statue carved from obsidian, a dark contrast against the suffocating white floral arrangements. Silent. Watching. Utterly dangerous. Even through the heavy lace, she could feel the sheer gravity of his presence. The whispers surrounding Jean Kwan were terrifying enough to make grown men bleed, ruthless underworld deals, enemies who vanished into thin air, and an empire built entirely on blood-soaked power. To Xena, he had been a terrifying mystery to be cautiously loved. To Zara, he was the ultimate prize. He was perfect. She finally reached the altar, stepping into his shadow. The air between them crackled, heavy with the scent of burning wax and unspoken sins. The priest began his solemn recitation, his holy words blurring into background noise as Zara focused entirely on the steady rise and fall of Jin's chest. When the time came, she parted her lips and murmured a flawless, trembling, "I do." His response was a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the very floorboards beneath her feet. "I do." The contract was sealed. The priest gestured for the groom to kiss his bride. Jin reached out, his movements agonizingly slow. As his fingers caught the edge of the delicate tool and swept it back over her crown, time seemed to completely freeze. The veil fell away, exposing her face to the light. Zara braced herself for the inevitable flash of shock, the momentary widening of his eyes when he realized the woman standing before him was not the gentle soul he had courted. She waited for the hesitation. She waited for the confusion. But as his dark, bottomless eyes met hers, she found neither. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He was entirely, horrifyingly aware. Before Zara could even process the sudden, chilling shift in the atmosphere, his large hand dropped from her veil and closed around her wrist. The grip wasn't a lover's touch. It was a vice, tightening painfully against her delicate bones, instantly trapping her in place. The triumph that had been blooming in Zara's chest violently warped into a cold, suffocating dread. And then, slowly, a dangerous, knowing smile spread across Jean Quan's face. A roar of applause erupted from the pews, shattering the tense silence at the altar. The guests rose to their feet, their faces bright with joyous approval. They thought it was love. They thought it was destiny, the beautiful culmination of a modern fairy tale. They were entirely, hopelessly wrong. To the crowd, the newly minted husband pulling his bride against his chest was a picture of passionate devotion. To Zara, it felt like being dragged into a cage. Jean leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. The movement was intimate, agonizingly slow, as if he were savoring the moment. "You smell different," he murmured, his voice a low, silken threat that cut cleanly through the sound of the cheering guests. Zara's heart executed a violent, erratic skip. She kept her expression perfectly composed for the cameras flashing in the periphery, but beneath the ivory silk of her bodice, a cold sweat began to gather. Before she could pull away, Jean yanked her closer. His large hand slid to the small of her back, his fingers digging into her waist with enough force to bruise. It was a brutal reminder of who currently held the power. "Your sister trembles when she lies," he whispered, the dark velvet of his tone scraping against her nerves. A suffocating pause stretched between them. Zara's lungs burned, refusing to take in air as his grip tightened even further, molding her body against the hard lines of his. "You don't." Panic, sharp and unfamiliar, clawed at the edges of Zara's mind. She was the one who pulled the strings. She was the architect of this deception. Refusing to surrender her control, she tilted her chin up, forcing a defiant, breathtaking smile for the benefit of the watching crowd. "Maybe you don't know her as well as you think," she challenged, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. Jean did not blink. The predatory amusement vanished from his expression, replaced by something infinitely darker. The shadows in his eyes seemed to swallow all the light in the cathedral. "Oh," he breathed softly, his gaze dropping to her lips before rising back to lock onto hers. "I know exactly who I married." A beat of profound silence fell over her, drowning out the roaring applause. The steel foundation of Zara's confidence, built over months of careful, meticulous planning, fractured violently. The arrogant certainty that she had outsmarted a kingpin began to crumble into dust. Jean lowered his head, his lips grazing her cheek as he delivered the final, devastating blow. "I chose you." That night, the sprawling estate he called home didn't feel like a palace. It felt like a cage. Massive. Cold. Watching. Every marble corridor and shadowed archway seemed to observe her with silent judgment as she navigated the gilded prison she had fought so hard to enter. When Zara pushed open the heavy double doors of the master suite, she braced herself to reclaim her power. She walked into the bedroom fully expecting to dictate the terms, ready to manipulate the board and establish her dominance in this twisted game of chess. Instead, she found him waiting in the dark. He was a solitary silhouette standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathed in the pale, icy glow of the moon. There were no armed guards flanking the walls. No ringing phones, no lackeys, no underworld distractions. Just him. Jean stepped forward, moving so slowly the action felt deliberate, almost lazy. The faint light caught the sharp, unforgiving angles of his face as he closed the distance between them. "Tell me," he said, his voice a low, rough grate that scraped against the quiet of the room. "Why did you think you could outplay me?" Zara refused to cower. Drawing on the iron will that had gotten her this far, she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, meeting his pitch-black gaze head-on. "I didn't think," she replied, her words ringing out clear and sharp. "I knew." A dangerous silence fell over the room. It stretched between them, thick and suffocating, wrapping around her throat like a wire snare. She waited for his temper to snap, for the legendary ruthlessness of Jean Quan to rear its head. Then, he laughed. It wasn't warm. It wasn't remotely amused. It was a dark, cruel sound that vibrated deep in his chest and made the fine hairs on the back of Zara's neck stand on end. "Good," he murmured, his footsteps completely silent against the plush rug. He began to circle her. It wasn't the slow stroll of a husband admiring his new bride, it was the calculated pacing of a predator sizing up its trapped prey. He moved with a terrifying grace, his presence a heavy, looming threat at her back. "Because I hate boring women," he whispered, his breath ghosting over her bare shoulder. Zara stood perfectly still as his shadow shifted around her, but beneath her skin, her confidence flickered once again. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin to breathe. She had studied every facet of Jean Quan's empire, every documented weakness and rumored strength. She had mapped his mind to perfection. Yet, as the silence swallowed his cruel laughter, a chilling realization took root in her chest. Something wasn't right. Something about the man she had just tethered her life to was entirely, fundamentally, off. Days bled into one another, a blur of heavy silk, champagne, and suffocating tension. Zara played her role to absolute perfection. To the outside world, she was the elegant, devoted wife of Jean Quan. Behind the towering iron gates of his estate, she acted the part of an untouchable queen, wearing her stolen crown with icy grace. But beneath her polished veneer, a quiet, insidious paranoia began to gnaw at her sanity. Nothing was right. There were no midnight meetings in smoke-filled rooms. No briefcases of untraceable cash. No weapons casually left on mahogany desks. The palpable aura of fear that was supposed to surround a brutal underworld kingpin was entirely absent. Even worse was the staff. They didn't tremble when Jean entered a room. They didn't avert their eyes in terror or scramble to appease him. Instead, they watched. They watched her. Their gazes held a chilling, silent knowingness, as if she were the punchline to a dark, elaborate joke she hadn't yet been told. The breaking point came on a moonless Tuesday night. When Jean slipped out of their suite, Zara didn't pretend to sleep. She waited until the latch clicked, then followed, moving through the halls like a ghost. Outside, there was no armored convoy waiting for him. No heavily armed bodyguards securing the perimeter. Just Jean, sliding behind the wheel of an unassuming, unmarked sedan. She tailed him in a borrowed staff car, keeping her distance as the gleaming city lights gave way to the grim, skeletal remains of the industrial district. The drive was eerily quiet, culminating at the rusted gates of a massive, abandoned textile factory. Zara killed the engine a block away and approached on foot. The night air was damp, clinging to her skin as she slipped through a broken side door, melting into the deep shadows of the concrete walls. Above her, on a rusted metal catwalk, two figures stood bathed in the pale, sharp glow of a single halogen bulb. Jean, and a man in a dark tactical uniform. Zara pressed her back against a concrete pillar, holding her breath. The cartel's network is completely mapped, the stranger said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space as he handed Jean a thick dossier. The raid is a go for Friday. Are your hands clean? Spotless, Jin's voice replied, entirely devoid of its usual dark amusement. It was clipped. Professional. Clinical. They still think I'm one of them. The wedding solidified my cover. Zara's blood turned to absolute ice. Cover? And the girl? The operative asked. You were supposed to extract the sister. Jean let out a harsh, dismissive breath. Xena was a liability. Too soft. She would have cracked. Zara, however, is arrogant enough to think she's the one pulling the strings. She walked right into the federal trap and locked the door herself. When the cartel falls on Friday, she's the perfect scapegoat. In the suffocating dark, Zara pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. She hadn't stolen an empire. She had stolen a death sentence. Zara pressed her spine so hard against the damp concrete pillar that the rough edges bit through her silk blouse. The revelation of the federal trap was still ringing in her ears, a deafening siren that drowned out all rational thought, when the stranger on the catwalk spoke again. Is she the one? The operative asked, leaning over the rusted railing to hand Jean a secondary file. Jean didn't hesitate. His voice was eerily calm, stripped entirely of the mocking indulgence he had worn since the wedding night. Yes. The dangerous twin. Zara froze. The cold air in the abandoned factory seemed to turn solid, trapping her in place. Dangerous? Twin? He didn't just know about the bridal switch, he had deeply profiled them. He had weighed Xena's soft heart against Zara's ruthless ambition and chosen the one whose greed would make her utterly blind to the snare. The operative flipped open a tactical lighter, the sharp metallic clink echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous space. And the other one? A suffocating silence stretched between the two men. Down in the shadows, Zara clamped a hand over her mouth, her pulse hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. When Jean finally answered, the calculated apathy in his tone was far more terrifying than any whispered Mafia legend. Safe, for now. A brutal, invisible weight slammed into Zara's chest, squeezing until her lungs burned. For now. Xena wasn't entirely out of the crosshairs. The sister she had so arrogantly believed she was outsmarting, and, in a twisted way, protecting from a monster, was still a piece on the board. Zara stumbled back a half step, her shoes scraping silently against the debris-littered floor. She had to get out. She had to think. As she melted further into the suffocating darkness, the fragmented pieces of the last few weeks violently aligned. The watchful staff. The lack of illicit activity. The chilling way Jean had smiled when he lifted her veil. Everything she had plotted, every move she thought was a masterstroke of manipulation, had been anticipated and encouraged. This wasn't about love. It wasn't about a marriage of convenience, or money, or seizing a criminal throne. This was a meticulously rigged, lethal game of chess. And as Zara fled into the bleak, moonless night, the ultimate, devastating truth finally shattered her ego. She wasn't the brilliant player she thought she was. She was the target. The drive back to the estate was a blur of hyperventilating panic that slowly hardened into white-hot fury. By the time Zara slammed the heavy bedroom doors open, the trembling girl in the abandoned factory had vanished, replaced by a woman fighting for her life. Jean was already there. He stood by the mahogany-wet bar, his back to her, casually unbuttoning his cuffs. You lied to me. Zara's voice tore through the oppressive silence, thick with a venom she didn't bother to hide. Jean didn't flinch. He didn't even turn around. With a slow, fluid grace, he reached for a crystal decanter and poured amber liquid over a single block of ice. The clinking of the glass was the only sound in the room. Calm. Controlled. Absolutely terrifying. Taking a deliberate sip, he finally pivoted to face her. You're just realizing, he murmured, the dark amusement returning to his tone. The condescension acted like gasoline on the fire in her chest. Zara stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could see the golden flecks in his obsidian eyes. She refused to be just a pawn. "You're not a mafia boss," she spat, the accusation hanging in the air like a drawn blade. Jean looked down at her. The edge of his mouth curled upward, forming a smile that was agonizingly slow and unapologetically deadly. "No," he agreed softly. A deafening pause stretched between them, heavy with the ghosts of everything she had misunderstood. He took another slow sip of his drink, his gaze tracking over her flushed, furious face. "I'm worse." Her breath caught, trapping itself painfully in her throat. The lingering warmth of her anger evaporated, replaced by the same icy dread she had felt hiding in the shadows of the factory. If he wasn't the king of the underworld, if he wasn't the monster the whispers claimed him to be. "What are you?" she breathed, the question escaping before she could stop it. Jean set his glass down on the marble counter. The soft thud sounded like a gavel falling. He took a slow, deliberate step out of the shadows and into the pale glow of the moon, revealing eyes that were no longer dark and amused, but as cold and hollow as forged steel. "I hunt people like you." A profound, suffocating silence dropped over the room. Zara couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She was entirely pinned beneath the weight of his stare. Jean leaned down, bringing his face mere inches from hers as he delivered the final, devastating blow. Liars. Manipulators. Predators hiding behind pretty faces. The foundation of Zara's reality did not just fracture, it completely collapsed. The grand, shadowed bedroom spun around her, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. She was standing in the presence of a man who made a living hunting monsters, and he had just categorized her as his prey. But as the sheer, suffocating gravity of her situation crashed over her, a single, agonizing question burned through the absolute chaos in her mind. "Where is my sister?" Her voice shook, stripped of all its previous bravado. It wasn't a demand anymore, it was a desperate plea. Jean did not answer immediately. He set his jaw, his terrifyingly calm demeanor shifting. He studied her pale, panicked face with an unsettling, clinical intensity. And then, for the first time since the moment he lifted her veil at the altar, Zara saw something flicker in his cold, obsidian eyes. Hesitation. "She came to me first," he said. The words were quiet, but they struck like a physical blow. Zara froze. The frantic beating of her heart seemed to stop altogether. "What?" Crying, Jean continued, his voice devoid of pity but heavy with absolute certainty. "Begging." A cold, creeping dread moved across Zara's skin. Her pulse pounded violently against her ribs, her mind desperately trying to reject the narrative he was weaving. "She told me everything about you," he murmured. "Every manipulation. Every calculated move. She gave me the complete blueprint of your mind, Zara. She knew exactly what you would do if the bait was placed in front of you." Fragments of the past few months suddenly flashed behind Zara's eyes in a blinding, terrifying montage. Zena's pervasive silence. The way she had flinched whenever Zara entered their small apartment. Her quiet, desperate fear. The strange, hollow distance she had kept, which Zara had so arrogantly dismissed as pre-wedding jitters. Zara had thought she was manipulating a weak, foolish girl into handing over a gilded crown. No. Zara backed away, shaking her head as the horrific truth began to sink its claws into her chest. No, that wasn't possible. Zena was soft. Zena was the helpless one. Zara was the brilliant protector, the one who took control because Zena couldn't survive in a harsh world. Jean stepped closer, effortlessly tracking her retreat until her spine hit the heavy mahogany door. He looked down at her trembling frame, a grim, unyielding judgment written across his sharp features. "She didn't want revenge," Jean whispered, his words cutting cleanly through her desperate, shattered delusions. A pause hung between them, thick and agonizing, before he drove the final, devastating stake through her heart. "She wanted to escape you." Zara staggered backward, her heels catching on the edge of the plush rug. She didn't stop until her shoulder collided with the heavy wood of the dresser, needing something solid to anchor her to a reality that was rapidly dissolving. Every assumption she had built her life upon, every twisted justification she had used to rationalize her cruelty, cracked violently down the middle. She had told herself she was the capable one. The survivor. She had convinced herself that taking Zena's place at the altar wasn't an act of theft, but an act of mercy for a sister too fragile to survive in a brutal world. "I'm not the villain," she whispered. But the words were hollow, and the violent tremor in her voice stripped away whatever conviction she tried to project. Jin's gaze did not soften. He watched her unravel with the detached, clinical observation of a hunter watching the poison finally take effect. There was no sympathy in his dark, hollow eyes. No grace for the fear that was suddenly clawing its way up her throat. "You stole her life," he stated, his voice a low, lethal hum in the quiet room. He took a slow, deliberate step closer. The sheer, suffocating gravity of his presence pressed down on her, shrinking the massive bedroom until there was nowhere left to run. He was no longer a husband, nor a mafia kingpin she could outsmart. He was an executioner. "I just made sure you had to live with yours." The first tear spilled over, hot and humiliating, tracking a wet path down her pale cheek. Then another followed. The ironclad armor Zara had worn since childhood shattered entirely, leaving her raw and bleeding. For the first time in her entire life, the brilliant, ruthless Zara Okoye felt incredibly, agonizingly small. She was powerless. She was completely, utterly exposed. The grand estate was no longer a prize, it was a tomb. The man standing before her wasn't a stepping stone to an empire, he was the warden who had handed her the key to her own cell and watched her lock it from the inside. Zena had orchestrated the perfect revenge, not by fighting back, but by letting Zara's own greed drag her into the abyss. "Where is she?" Zara begged, the arrogant fire in her soul entirely extinguished. Her voice was a broken, desperate rasp. "Please. Where is my sister?" A long, agonizing silence stretched through the shadowed room. Jean stood over her, his expression carved from unyielding stone as he let the absolute ruin of her pride echo in the quiet space. He looked at the trembling, broken woman who had once thought herself a queen, and delivered the single word that ended the game forever. "Free." Weeks had passed, bleeding together into one long, agonizing blur. The sprawling estate, once a dazzling symbol of Zara's ultimate triumph, had been stripped down to its bones. There were no armed guards patrolling the grounds. There was no terrifyingly calm husband waiting in the shadows. The intoxicating, blood-soaked power she had sacrificed her soul to steal had evaporated entirely into the ether. There was only silence. Thick. Suffocating. Absolute. Zara stood alone in the center of the Grand Master suite, staring blankly into the gilded, floor-to-ceiling mirror. The reflection staring back was unrecognizable. The untouchable queen she had spent months meticulously crafting was gone. There was no stolen crown resting upon her head. There was no glorious victory radiating from her eyes. There was only the brutal, inescapable truth. She had successfully conquered the board. She had won the twisted game she had started. And in doing so, she had lost absolutely everything that mattered. Her hollow gaze drifted from the mirror to the sleek mahogany table near the window. A single, crisp white envelope rested on the surface, undisturbed. Her hands trembled as she forced herself to walk toward it, the profound quiet of the room roaring deafeningly in her ears. She picked it up, breaking the wax seal with numb fingers, and unfolded the heavy parchment. Jin's handwriting was exactly like the man himself, cold, sharp, and flawlessly executed. The words stared back at her, tearing through the last fragile remnants of her sanity. "You wanted her life. Now live yours, without her." Zara's breath hitched painfully in her chest. A suffocating pause hung in the heavy air as she forced her eyes to drop lower. At the very bottom of the page, written with a devastating, final precision, was the last line she would ever receive from the man who had ruined her. "Some victories are just slower punishments." The parchment slipped from her trembling fingers, drifting silently like a ghost before settling on the floor. Zara's legs finally gave out. She sank to the cold marble beneath her, the agonizing isolation of the empty mansion breaking the very last of her defenses. Hot, bitter tears spilled freely over her cheeks, landing on her empty hands. The ironclad armor of superiority she had worn since childhood dissolved into nothing. Because as she wept alone in the ruins of a stolen empire, a profound, soul-crushing clarity washed over her. For the first time in her life, the brilliant, ruthless Zara Okoye finally understood. She didn't lose to her sister's quiet escape. She didn't lose to Jean Kwan's lethal trap. She had lost to herself. This story teaches that jealousy can make you destroy what you can never rebuild. Not every enemy comes to hurt you, some come to expose you. Winning by deception often leads to a life you can't escape. The most dangerous traps are the ones you walk into willingly. I want to hear from you. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I've got a question for you. Do you think Zara deserved what happened to her? Drop your answer in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next story might change your perspective even more.